All right, let's talk about psychology's moral compass. You know, the rules that keep research in check? But this isn't just going to be some dry list of do's and don'ts. Oh no. Think of this more like a detective story. We're going to look back at some of the most famous and, frankly, infamous studies in history to see how they forced us to build these rules from the ground up, often because of the harm they caused.
And it all boils down to this one huge question. How do we study people without actually harming them? I mean, think about it. The whole point of psychology is to figure out the human mind, right? But how do you do that while keeping the people you're studying safe? It's this constant tension. And for a long, long time, the quest for knowledge, well, it came at a pretty devastating human cost.
So before we had these clear rules, this solid framework, the search for knowledge sometimes went to some pretty dark places. You had researchers who were, driven by this intense curiosity, and they pushed the boundaries. They pushed them way too far. And that's when we started to see the real human cost of that kind of unchecked ambition. And what's wild is that some of the most famous psychological studies, the ones that were once celebrated as groundbreaking, well, they're famous now for a totally different reason, for the ethical lines they completely blew past. They're basically taught as cautionary tales now. They really held up a mirror to the scientific community and forced it to look at some very uncomfortable truths.
So that's what we're going to do. We're going to dive into 4 of these infamous studies. These are the big ones, the experiments that literally redefined our ethical boundaries and became the foundation for the rules we have today. Each one is a powerful story about what happens when science, when it loses its way. Okay, this table really gives you a quick snapshot of the whole mess. You've got the Milgram study, causing just severe psychological distress. The Stanford prison experiment, which led to actual physical and psychological harm. Then there's the Little Albert experiment, harming a child and not even trying to fix it. And maybe the most shocking, the Tuskegee syphilis study, where they lied to people for decades and withheld treatment. Every single one of these was a massive failure, a painful lesson that directly led to the rules we have now. This isn't just a list of screw-ups, it's the very roadmap that forced science to get its act together.
So let's zoom in on one of these, the Milgram obedience study. Just try to put yourself in that room for a second. There's a guy in a lab coat, an authority figure, telling you to keep pressing a button. And with every press, you believe you're delivering an increasingly painful electric shock to another person who's screaming in the next room. The whole point was to study obedience, sure, but what it's really remembered for is the incredible psychological stress it put people through.
And this harm wasn't some abstract idea. It was real. You could see it. People were sweating, shaking, some even broke into this weird, nervous laughter, which is a classic sign of someone under extreme stress. They were completely torn between what their conscience was screaming at them and the pressure from this authority figure telling them to continue.
So when you break it down, the ethical violations in Milgram's study were just huge. You've got that severe psychological distress we just talked about. The deception was intense, with no real safety net. People didn't feel like they could just get up and leave. And there was no follow-up, no support for the stress they'd just been put through. It was a total failure to protect the participants.
Okay, so when these stories got out, Milgram, Stanford, and especially Tuskegee, the fallout was massive. It went way beyond the academic world. It created a real crisis of trust. The public started asking, wait a minute, can we actually trust these scientists? Are they looking out for us at all? And that public outcry, it forced a huge system-wide reckoning.
And you can see that path from harm to accountability right here on this timeline. It starts way back in 1920 with the Little Albert experiment. Then in 32, the Tuskegee study begins and goes on for 40 years. Then you have Milgram in the 60s, Stanford in 71 getting shut down early. It was just one thing after another. So when you see the Belmont report pop up in 1979, you know it wasn't just some random committee decision. No way. It was a direct emergency response to decades of these ethical train wrecks.
So out of all that chaos, we finally get psychology's new rules, a real framework to protect people. Think of it like this. From the ashes of all these terrible studies, a clear set of principles rose up. And the whole point was to make sure that science would never, ever again exploit the very people it was supposed to be learning from.
And rule number 1, the absolute bedrock of modern research, is something called informed consent. This idea is a total game changer. It basically shifts the power from the researcher back to the participant. It says, you have the right to know exactly what you're signing up for, and you have the absolute right to say no.
And an informed consent is so much more than just signing a piece of paper. It's a whole process. It means the researcher has to tell you in plain language what the study is for, what you'll be doing, and any potential risks involved. And this is the big one.
You have to know you can walk away at any time, for any reason, no questions asked, a right that was tragically denied to the men in the Tuskegee study for 40 years.
All right, next up is another huge principle: protection from harm. This one is a direct response to the kind of awful stress we saw in the Milgram and Stanford studies. It makes it crystal clear that a researcher's #1 job isn't just to collect data. Their primary job is to actively protect the well-being of the people in their study, both physically and mentally. And this isn't something they think about later. It's proactive. Before anyone even walks into the lab, researchers have to go through these steps. They have to assess any possible risk. They have to justify why that risk is worth taking for the scientific value. They have to have a solid plan to minimize any harm. And if someone does get upset or distressed, they have to be ready to provide support. It's like a built-in safety net for every single study.
But what about deception? Like in the Milgram study, where they weren't told the truth. Well, today, using deception is really, really rare. It's only allowed if it's absolutely essential to the study and if it's not going to cause any real harm. And, this is the important part, if a researcher does use it, they have to follow up with a full debriefing afterward. That means explaining everything, answering every question, and making sure the person leaves feeling totally respected and in the loop. So all of this brings us to what might be the most important point of all. It's really easy to look at all these rules and think of them as just red tape, barriers to getting research done. But that's not what they are at all. They're the foundation. They are the very thing that makes good, trustworthy science even possible.
I mean, just look at the difference between then and now. The shift has been absolutely massive. We went from deception being common to it being rare and tightly regulated. Harm went from being an accepted risk to something you have to actively prevent. And maybe the biggest change, we went from treating people like subjects to treating them like partners in the research. The whole philosophy is just flipped.
Because at the end of the day, the stakes are just so incredibly high. It's about way more than one bad study. When research crosses a line, it doesn't just harm the people involved, it damages the credibility of science itself. It chips away at public trust, and that makes it harder for all scientists to do the kind of important work that actually helps us all.
So really what it all comes down to is this. These ethical rules aren't about being scared to ask the tough questions. Not at all. They're about creating a framework so we can ask those tough questions responsibly. It's about doing science with integrity and with a deep respect for the people who make it possible. And that really brings us right up to the present day. All these principles we've talked about, they were forged in the fire of past mistakes. But the conversation is nowhere near over. As our technology gets more and more powerful, think about things like AI and advanced neuroimaging, we're going to face a whole new set of ethical questions. So we have to keep asking ourselves, what new lines are we in danger of crossing? And how can the painful lessons of the past guide us through the ethical maze that lies ahead?